Hello, and welcome to Robotics Today. My name is Monroe Kennedy, and today I'm excited to introduce Chad Jenkins as our speaker. Chad Jenkins is a professor of computer science and the associate director of the Robotics Institute at the University of Michigan. Professor Jenkins received his PhD from the University of South California in 2003. He served as faculty at Brown University for 11 years, then joined the University of Michigan. His research addresses problems in interactive robotics and human-robot interaction, where he is a leader in the field. The breadth of his research covers mobile manipulation, robotic perception, as well as robot learning, particularly learning from demonstration. Professor Jenkins has received many prestigious awards, including being recognized as a Sloan Research Fellow. He is a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, PCASE, and he has many Young Investigator Awards, including ONR, AFOSR, and NSF. Professor Jenkins is the editor-in-chief for the ACM Transactions on Human-Robotic Interaction, and he is a fellow of AAAS and AAAI, and a senior member of the ACM and IEEE. And he is an alumnus of the Defense Science Study Group. It is my pleasure to have him as a speaker today. Chad, the stage is yours.
Excellent. So thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor. Thank you, Monroe, Jeanette, and on all of the Robotics Today organization. I want to say that this is really going to be an experiment because there's so much to say. And so I'm going to go through it really fast, but hopefully it'll be a resource out there for everybody. So I think there are a lot of things some difficult discussions that we need to have, difficult topics, in addition to all the great things we do from a technical perspective. And so I want to get through those. And so I'm going to go through a lot of stuff really fast. I'm going to do most of my presentation down here in this little corner. So you'll see me down here. And I just want to start off by saying by just showing me. So this is me. I've been in robotics for over 20 years and in computer science for close to 30. And so if you've seen my talk before, you'll know that I ask, what question do you think I get the most when I'm on campus or just doing around sort of my normal space? And so if you've seen this talk before, you'll know that the number one question I get is, am I with the football team? And so if you've seen me say this, my answer is no. But for the good people on this call, I'm going to do something a little different today and say that actually the answer is yes, but in 1988. And so this is me as a freshman in high school playing football. And I also thought it was important because I'm an American, so I have a different definition of what football means. But I only played for 1 year, and so I'm fortunate that I was able to go to college and study computer science and mathematics and leave debt free because I was definitely not going to do it on my athletic ability. And so I'm grateful to my parents for allowing me to do this, and also providing me a pathway into a career where I can study, where I can get into artificial intelligence and robotics. And this is really a fabulous time to be in robotics because there's so many things that we can be able to do. I'd love to talk about how we can have declarative ways of doing robot programming from demonstration. I am enthralled by the NeRF revolution that's going on that really can do a lot for improving robot perception. And I'd love to talk about all of those. Especially how we can perceive transparent objects. Transparency is really difficult for us to deal with, and it's something that I think is really interesting. And so we've developed NeRF-like methods for doing this, and so we can perceive transparent objects and be able to do things like in this case, we're building a champagne tower. And so perceiving those transparent objects in a white background is actually really hard. And so we've been inspired by a lot of work that goes on with light field inference and different ways of thinking about layered transparency. But as we do this work, there are some things that go in the back of my head, and that when we think about robotics, the term robot itself, where does it come from? What does that mean? What are we doing in robotics overall? If we go back, we can see that the term robot itself is actually not a scientific term. It comes from science fiction. It was defined by Karl Čapek in his play Rossum's Universal Robots back from the 1920s. The term actually came from his brother Josef Čapek, and what it really means, it's a Czech word. It's derived from a Czech word that essentially means forced labor or serf or slave, literally slave. And if you go through the play, I actually haven't read the play. I've read the Wikipedia version of the play. That's terrible of me, but but the storyline goes that that they built robots to do service tasks for people, and as a way of having service labor, exploitable service labor, and and these robots became sentient and took over and destroyed humanity. And the problem is that we sort of see these same themes in science fiction. They sort of carried on, maybe in different ways, maybe some more positive about humanity, some more dystopian, but that still continues. And one thing that concerns me is that is this notion of robots that are meant to be exploitable service. Is sort of it carries a lot of how we think about the technical aspects of what we do. We still think of robots primarily in a servitude sort of role. And that it can be difficult for me to square. The tension really comes at the end of the day because we are, as roboticists, we care about the science of what we do. We care about innovation and being excellent in the science. That is something that is just core to to why we're in this in the beginning. And I understand that because I feel that. But at the same time, there has to be a commitment to equal opportunity that's balanced. And so I'm always trying to straddle that line of creating equal opportunity for everybody across our society, as well as being excellent at what I do, because those are two different dimensions. Both of these, in order for those to be sustainable, there has to be an economic incentive that allows for that to be sustained and to grow. In an ideal world, we'd be at the intersection where we'd have equal opportunity, we'd have innovation, and they would all be economically viable. But the reality is that equal opportunity, diversity usually gets lost in the shuffle. And computing and robotics historically has only thought about innovation and the economics of it, and equal opportunity sort of gets put as a secondary consideration. And this all came to the head for a lot of people, came to the forefront Memorial Day of last year, when we saw the result of really the discrimination that has happened over long periods of time, over histories, over centuries, and we saw it on display in a way that we really could not deny. This led to a lot of soul searching by a lot of people, including myself and some of my colleagues, which motivated us to write the Black in Computing open letter that talked about how we could do better as a computing community when it comes to issues of race and equal opportunity, to think about how we could do this as individuals, as organizations, and also as communities, as research communities and larger ecosystems. I would say that and one thing that they said with this is that is a common refrain is a lot of Black people are tired because it's just very exhausting to try to have to balance equal opportunity and the innovation we're striving to achieve. This led a lot of people to do things. It led to change here locally at Michigan, in that we had a Juneteenth celebration that celebrated the end of chattel slavery in the United States. And there were a lot of things that happened, but to me, it didn't come clear. It didn't become real about how what we do in robotics and artificial intelligence has a real impact until I learned about the events of January 9th, 2020, which was my 46th birthday. And while I was celebrating with my family and my friends and my research group, I learned about what was happening at that same time. Is not far away from Ann Arbor, where I live, Robert Williams, who's a resident of Farmington Hills, was arrested purely based off of a bad facial recognition hit. And this was documented by the ACLU, that basically said that facial recognition made a mistake with Robert, and he was detained purely off of that. This is just showing the actual person that committed the crime in sort of grainy video, and it basically said that this was the man, which is documented right now as the first automated false positive arrest by American law enforcement. And so he was detained for over 30 hours. He was arrested in front of his neighbors, his friends, his family, his children. There is a very powerful video that they put out that really sort of goes through they provides an account of this case. And Mr. Williams wrote a great op-ed that gives some enlightenment, gives some perspective on why why the problems and the troubles this can have, and how it could affect not just him but many people across our nation and across our world. And if it can happen to him, it could happen to anybody. I worry about this of the technologies that I'm helping to develop actually being impacted upon me, because in this case, if we take what the arrest record that we have and we just and we sort of consider other examples, such as this example of a grainy video of President Obama trying to blow up the super resolution, it clearly is not President Obama that you get out, which is troubling, given how much people are expecting out of neural network based artificial intelligence. Um, you could have one explanation for this, that this really isn't a computing problem. This isn't an AI problem. It's if you would have trained the data differently, you would have gotten a different result. And as people in the community have pointed out, that explanation is not really good. While technically correct, it is really irresponsible and wrong, because you have to consider who are the people who are developing this technology. Does it look like your old school 60s boardroom? Does it look like what you'd see in the social network, or what we see in popular media is telling us what somebody who is developing technology should look like? And so you're missing the point here. And so this is something that should consider us, that should concern us, not just from the perspective of just sort of these popular media things, but it's something that's a part of what we do in robotics. If we look at the tableau that Georgia Tech put out for ICRA, deep learning based systems is clearly by far and away the most popular topic for papers and authors in ICRA. Vastly eclipsing your traditional leading areas of motion planning and SLAM. If we think about, and this is a robotics wide thing, we can think about venues that focus on this specifically. So if you look at the conference on robot learning, we should be concerned that that these technologies, robot learning is heavily focused on deep learning these days. But if you look through who's participating in this, we see no Black researchers. We see no people that are likely going to be affected by this technology. It's not just an issue of demographic diversity, but also intellectual diversity. If you look and see who's on the programming committees, who's on the organizational committees, whose papers do you see in the program? You're seeing a lot of the same names over and over and over. And so how do we include more different ideas? It's easy to go with things that we think are successful, but the hard things that are out there that could get us out of potential intellectual local minima, those are things that we have to be mindful of. And maybe that means we have to accept some ideas that are not necessarily that we would consider as matured as things that have been around for a while. This is why I wrote during the summer, we should think about, how we're investing into artificial intelligence will have a big impact on the outputs that we're seeing. And we should think about that as more money comes into AI and robotics. If we look and see that the NRIPI meeting was happening this week, I think, typically if you go there, you don't see a lot of minority participation. When I go there, I usually anecdotally see it around maybe 3%. And those are the people that are getting the resources to affect the future of the field of AI and robotics. If we look specifically at explainable artificial intelligence, which is supposed to address some of these problems with neural networks, I can't find any Black researchers who are involved. I don't know for sure because I'm not a part of this program, but the concern is always that you're playing it from both sides, that you're getting funded to develop these technologies, and you're also getting funded to remedy the bad effects of these technologies as well. And so if you're going to do that, we need representation from both sides. And this is really if you're going to have better representation to deal with these issues, we should understand that we still have systemic problems in AI. AI has failed systemically because we've built up a pipeline that has not included Black researchers. We have very few and marginalized Black AI researchers. And so I took this picture from Viola Jones. Viola Jones isn't the problem. They actually addressed these issues in that paper, but from back early facial recognition work from back in the 2000s. But researchers who develop these AI technologies are robotic technologies. If we don't have representation there, then we're not going to get representation in the classroom or in the research lab, because faculty really help generate the next leaders and innovators. And so if you don't have diversity in the research lab, you're not going to have diversity on the development teams, because they're not going to come out of universities. They're not going to have trained people who are ready to contribute. And so we've just produced we've had low production of Black CS graduates or Black engineering graduates on the whole. And because of that lack of diversity, that's led to the end use of having systems that are uneducated, that are used in an uneducated way by law enforcement. If I don't think about law enforcement in general, you just think of this as the uneducated and unwise use of AI technology. There's been great work out there. So some of the people that are on this call, work by Temnet Gabriel and others, that have thought about this front end problem, which is how are we using the technology the right way? How are we? What's going to be the impact of this technology that's being produced, and how should we think about that and do it responsibly? And that's great work. That's not what I do, because I really think about what I call the back end problem. How do we actually get more better representation in the research lab and in the classroom, so that we can produce more people, better representation on the development teams, in the executive suites as well, because that really is where that is where the springwell of technology is produced. And so we can either create a vicious cycle of non-diversity and ill effects from society, or we can create a virtuous cycle where we have diversity in our research labs and our classrooms that will cascade and have good effects, or better effects, I should say. And so I want to get to these points in really three directions. Really, this has to deal with how we do curriculum for robotics, how we think about robotics research, and the policies surrounding all of this. And so I want to talk about this first from the research perspective. And in that research perspective, I would say that our first problem that we have is we have a systemic overfitting. I would personally claim that a lot of the AI, a lot of the neural networks that we're generating now are overfitting. I know that's sort of a lightning topic, and I'm happy to talk about that. But these technologies are easier and easier to use. They seem accurate, but that overfitting causes some bad effects. So anybody could pick up one of these systems right now, and they can pick up a neural network system if they can get access to a lot of data to train, which actually itself is creating its own cottage industry of just creating good training data. If you can do that, you can just pick something up and you can start predicting away and start doing recognitions of all sorts of things in different types of environments, and deal with these issues of perception in an uncertain world. But the problem is that when you look at the results from this and up close, you'll notice that ain't right. A lot of times it looks good, but it's not good enough for you to completely trust. This is partially because we have things like false positives that are things that are identified incorrectly. And then you also have false negatives, which are things that are not identified, and that non-identification is incorrect itself. And this can lead to a lot of bad effects, because if you depend on these systems, you have to ask yourself, how did these mistakes occur? You can ask yourself, how do we fix them? But if you're somebody who's impacted by this, you're asking yourself, what was the cost paid for this mistake? And and if I'm thinking of myself as somebody who could be in Mr. Robert Williams' shoes, I'm asking myself, could that cost me my life or my freedom? And I'm fortunate enough that I have a platform where I can speak out. A lot of people don't have that platform. And so really, if even if a excellent result for us is 99% accuracy, but does 99% accuracy really mean anything if you can't characterize the 1% of the time that you're wrong? How can you trust necessarily any result? And this is because what we're oftentimes relying on in terms of neural network systems is we're relying on discriminative inference, which these days has good recall, has a great recall, is fast, but is inexplicable, and that we don't necessarily know how that result was generated, or we can't explain it readily. We can't have some way of knowing why did we get that, or how the data sort of yield that result. And this goes in contrast to what I came up with in machine learning when I was a graduate student, when we had systems that were robust and explainable. You knew what was happening in the system because you had a model sitting behind it, but it was dirt slow. It would be something you ran on the cluster, and you would let your job run overnight, or it would run over a couple of days, and then you would get your answer back, and hopefully it was good enough to put in your paper. But I think in the thing that has made neural networks so successful are a lot of the systems issues, GPUs, increased data, being able to optimize the performance of these systems. And I think you could do the same thing with generative inference. If you could address the slow part of this, you could have something that runs fast enough to either be competitive with discriminative inference, or you could get the best of both worlds. And that's what we're striving for. And so when I think about this, I think about a lot of the work that we're trying to do is trying to make probabilistic generative inference fast enough that it can be used in a number of scenarios, usually probably with neural networks in complement. And so we're trying to make non-parametric belief propagation faster. And so I don't believe we're ready for geometry to just throw away 3D geometry, but we can consider 3D geometry as a prior on parts of an object that we can compose together kinematically. And we can use belief propagation to do that at that, as in some of the work that we've produced from my lab. And so the idea is that we could use a neural network to give us a heat map of where it thinks things can be. We can use that as a candidate a result that we don't fully trust. We're going to use probabilistic inference to back that up. And then in particular, we're going to use it'll be expressed in sort of a graphical model for a parts-based description of an object. And then when we do this belief propagation, we should be able to generate a result that gives us a good estimate that we could work with. But we also have probability mass in case we made a mistake, and we can take actions to try to resolve any ambiguity or any misclassifications. And so, so I think there are technical ways that we can address this problem, but at the end of the day, who gets to decide what's good enough? And that really comes down to who's in the room, who's in the research lab, who's in the classroom, who's going to be on the development team. And that's where we have to come back and think about, where are we producing future generations? And this comes down to our curriculum. And it leads to our second problem that we're really dealing with, which I would call a chokehold on opportunity. This chokehold on opportunity is not a new concept. It really comes back to something we've been discussing for many years. If you remember what this is the leaky pipeline that has been talked about for many years in terms of education. When you think about all the students that could be scientists and engineers in the STEM disciplines, we lose them along the way, and so we actually produce a small yield of people that we need to be in science in the STEM disciplines, and an even smaller yield of women and minorities. And so this means that we're falling short of the workforce demand, but we're not creating equal opportunity, and we're seeing that in the outcomes. I would argue that the leaky pipeline we shouldn't use that metaphor. In fact, a lot of people tell me we shouldn't use that metaphor anymore, but I would claim what we have is a clogged pathway, because a lot of students want to do AI, which leads them into doing computer science or electrical engineering, and we just don't have enough faculty right now to meet that demand. When we think about that, any student in a major R1 research institution would say that wants to take upper level CS classes, especially in AI or machine learning, will tell you it is really hard to get into class. And that leads to frustrations for everybody. And I worry that the model is not sustainable because it's not just, in this story, they're talking about UT Austin, it's at Michigan, it's all across our country. And this is something that, that is just is now a foundational problem for how we educate and how we generate future generations of roboticists. I would argue that the causality for this can be seen in the annual salary report that Michigan Engineering puts out. And so, if you look at the data from this report, you can see that in our College of Engineering, one of the majors that relates to computing is massive. It's bigger than any other major. It's over a third of the college student. The number of majors is over a third of the College of Engineering. And the reason for that is because the students see that there is a huge payday waiting for them. If they major in a computing discipline, they could make $30,000 or $40,000 more than majoring in any other discipline. And you'll note that a lot of the companies that are offering these high salaries are companies that are actively engaged in artificial intelligence and robotics. You'll see a lot of familiar names if you look through that report. And that is a major issue. Not only that, part of it is that students can't take, if they want to do robotics and AI, they have to wait till their third or fourth year to do it. And maybe they're interested in it, but maybe they actually want to do something else, but they just want some exposure to robotics and AI, and we're not really providing that. More importantly, we see the results of this, and I'm very proud of my department for producing a diversity annual report last year, and then being able to and making a commitment to publish this annually, to give us a sense of where we're going in terms of diversity. But the reality is when we look through this report and we see the numbers for undergraduate enrollment, we note that we've created a hyper competitive environment that is weeding out a lot of Black students. And there's a number of other troubling dimensions to this. But if we look over the 2,500 majors that we have in the computing disciplines at Michigan, we only have 39 Black students, and that ain't right. And we really need to do better. These are numbers, but if you want a personal account to understand how this affects students individually, I'd recommend reading this profile of Datriana Burks-Reed, who didn't finish our program. And I think, like a lot of students, actually went into a lot of debt and did not get a degree in the end. And I think this gets to the heart of where our model may not be sustainable, and it may not be sustainable for the type of tuition we're paying and the outcomes we're producing, which give us a lot of concern in higher education. I would claim that a lot of the problems that we have are because we haven't necessarily updated our curricular model. So if we go back to the ACM curricular recommendations of 2005, we still have sort of a 1990s model of electrical engineering, computer science, and computer engineering in the middle. And we need to broaden out. We need more pathways into our field. And so that's one thing that we're trying to do, is create the robotics pathways here at Michigan to try to offer new possibilities and lighten the load, lighten this clogged pathway. We want to start with linear algebra, make it fun, because linear algebra you can just do amazing things with that when you program it. We want to help students find their pathways into robotics and have really true equal partnerships with HBCUs. We don't want to say we have a grant to write, we need a minority partner, let's go reach out to the HBCUs. That is not a good dynamic at all. We need to be able to have a true equal partnership and build on that for the long term. If you read ASE Prism, you can see that we talked about our approach with Jesse Grizzle, who's the director of Michigan Robotics. We created a computational linear algebra class, and there's a great story about it in ASE Prism. One thing that I take exception to is they said when they marketed it, they said that we're going to try to push calculus out. That's not necessarily true. All I'm saying is we should lead with linear algebra. That's really it. So I think we can make it fun that way. And so as I move moving on, I just want to say, when you're teaching, you should understand that if you really want to have equal rights for anybody, that it requires equal rights for everybody. The same way that the deck can get stacked against some student that might get weeded out of your program, that could happen to your kids, or maybe even you at some point. And so you want to make sure that we're being fair for everybody. And this gets to the second half. To the last topic I want to address, which is really the policy issues of what we're doing in artificial intelligence. And I want to make I really want to say that in this case we can take a look at how AI relates to the civil rights movement and try to develop something where we can truly incentivize equal opportunity. And so, if we go back to the word robota and think about what this means, this is only really one part of a system that that creates these systemic effects. It's we think of robots just as an intellectual exercise, but really any type of forced labor has an entire system around it that makes it go. And so that applies also to the slave labor that made the United States an economic superpower. So if we take this as one example, as sort of one part of what made the United States run when it was an agrarian economy, it really was in the era of antebellum slavery, pre-war slavery. And so the forced labor was really just one part of that. You need to have an exploitable labor force that could make things for you or produce things cheaply. So that could be robots or that could be people. And this applies not just to the United States, but also many other situations that we've seen historically around the world. In addition to that, you need an economic driver. In the case of the United States, it was cotton. So King Cotton was the thing that was produced, and that really made an incentive that made the southeast of the United States the Silicon Valley of its time. Similarly, you also have to have a way to enforce that exploitable labor to work. And that really means you have to have a police state. And in that case, you had law enforcement that was really the job to oversee and keep slave labor in line. And if you want to have if you want to just get a sense of how law enforcement is so ingrained in this notion of overseeing slaves or slave labor as terms of Black people in this country, you should go back and listen to the first superstar country group, which was the Skillet Lickers, and they made a hugely popular song that leaves me troubled because when they talk about it, whenever they say patty roller, they're talking about law enforcement. And if you listen to it, it's not an easy song to listen to. You could understand that gives you, the feeling that you might get gives you a sense of why Black people feel this way about law enforcement, not just in the wake of George Floyd, but over the span of time throughout the history of our country. And so with with given that you can have economies built on exploitable labor, we really this is a historical trend that usually is sparked through technological innovation. Slavery did not become economically profitable until the invention of the cotton gin. Maybe Eli Whitney wasn't thinking about exploitable labor and the harms of slavery. He was just thinking, I'm making something cool and that could work and solve a real problem. But it had a huge impact. Is AI the same thing as the cotton gin was, 2 centuries ago? I worry about that. I think about that a lot. If we think about the history of artificial intelligence, Niels Nielsen wrote a fabulous book that goes through the chronicles the history of artificial intelligence, its development, the people that really brought it to where it is today, and name drop and all the funding that enabled these people to produce these great technologies. It also just goes to show that there were no Black AI researchers cited. Basically, it means that the Black people have not. I mean, my interpretation of it is that Black people just haven't had a role in artificial intelligence. And so, it is that sort of mixed emotion that I have when I read it, for both good and for bad. We can see that this isn't just something that's in the history, but it's here today. So if we look at who is deciding what is fairness in artificial intelligence, there are active calls on this, active funding funding solicitations for people to define what is fairness and how we should address it. But the problem is that when you look and you see who's funded, I can't find any Black people. Maybe there are there, I don't know, but like it does, I can't say this gives me a lot of confidence in what fairness will look like for artificial intelligence when I see where the investment is going. And it isn't just today, because this is a solicitation that came out just in the last few years. If you look at how Amazon has funded over the last, at the history before that, I can't find any Black people that were funded by them, and that should leave me troubled. it's not just Amazon over the last 6 or 7 years, but this is something goes back throughout the history of how we funded scientific research throughout our history. So if we go back to the founding of the National Science Foundation and Vannevar Bush, who really put into place the amazing the amazing science and technology research enterprise for the country that has paid off massive returns on investment, has just been one of the best things that the country could have done. You'll note that in that this is historically, inclusion just has not been a part of it. Representation hasn't. If you look at his namesake fellowship that is talking about the best people, the best scientists that have been produced, out of the over $300 million that's been awarded, I can only find one Black person that's gotten one of these awards, and we're talking about a massive amount of money. And this should be troubling over the entire history of the scientific enterprise. And one thing that we should note, that as there are plans to put a massive influx of money into artificial intelligence and robotics, is this going to, as well as quantum computing, is this really going to lead to equal opportunity? Do I feel like I actually have a shot at getting these funds? Right now I don't. And so what's going to be the result of this funding? It will lead to technical advancements. We need that funding. We need that investment. But if we don't have the proper mechanisms for merit review and peer review, that money may produce very ill effects in our society. We should think a lot about how we're investing in things now, because if we don't have diversity, we don't have representation, it leads to very bad outcomes. And there's a massive body of literature on this that people should pay attention to. But what you should think about is, how will history judge our mentoring, our merit review processes, our investments? This is something that goes back many centuries, and it's not just an issue of what you're doing today. And so we should be thinking about this. And there are examples that we have to consider. This isn't just, if we think of the cotton gin and the evolution of antebellum slavery and its impact economically and in terms of labor and in terms of the discriminatory effects that still exist today, there is history that you can draw upon. Because what happened was, when you have one economic power that's rising and colliding with another one, such as the North and the South of the United States, that leads to that. I worry that leads to war. And so there was a big war, American Civil War, that fortunately led to the establishment. To bringing the Union together and establishing the United States and freeing the slaves. Thank you for that. But the question is, how would you give these people that were former slaves rights and give them and integrate them into society? And we had a Reconstruction era that was really that really failed. And at the end of it, it led to people saying, what should we do in terms of equal rights? And Booker T. Washington, who is a amazing organizer and founder of many things that have helped the Black community during his time, during the late 1800s through Reconstruction. He basically said the way to do this is to not worry about social rights, not worry about policy. Just ask for investment, give us jobs, give us opportunities, and we won't ask for the policies that will allow us to be equal, truly equal in a systemic sense. But the problem, and so you can sort of say that as asking, if we laid this out on axes, that's asking for investment and sort of ignoring policy. Policy is just sort of an orthogonal direction that we're not considering. And the problem with that, if you just consider the investment and just getting some people to fulfill roles in organizations, it leads to bad effects. Because as a result of the Atlanta Compromise of 1895, the rise of Black people coming into getting economic viability led to a number of clashes, such as the Atlanta Massacre of 1906. It led to lynchings. So a lot of the lynchings were due to concerns about of people who were in power, concerns about their jobs and their economic opportunities. it led to just massive destruction of Black economic centers, and such as the Tulsa Race Massacre. My dad was a little baby in Beaumont, Texas, when they had when there was the Beaumont Race Riot of 1943, which is about jobs at the railroads and the refineries. It's if you don't have to go far from Ann Arbor, where I am now, to think about how people didn't want, they wanted to have segregated communities, and how that led to violence against Black people. In addition, what it took for the country to really see that this was a problem was a 14-year-old boy who just was in a grocery store and said hello to a woman, or just talked to her, and he was essentially mutilated and murdered. 14 years old. And that really, and the fact that they had the pictures woke the country up to these issues. And these days we don't really think about it, because if you ask most people right now, what does it mean to have dogs and hoses, we think about like dogs and hoses, right? But in the 60s, when you were trying to when there was a fight for equality, if you just add 1963 to a web search about dogs and hoses, you can see the brutality that people had to face to demand the equal rights, to demand the policies that are needed so they can be first class citizens and have true economic opportunity. Because and this led up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which legally created equal stature for any organization with regard to and how they employ people, and especially if they're doing federal funding, they can't have disparate impact. They have to have equitable outcomes. And that Civil Rights Act of 1904 didn't just make things better for Black people; it made it better for everybody across the board, and created the kind of environment the more inclusive environment that has attracted a lot of people to the United States. And really, that what that means is that we had to have policy to go with that investment to make that systemic. And this isn't just this wasn't really just about civil rights in this form. It led to Title IX, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is what has made us stronger, make us be able to better utilize and get the best of the talent that we have here in our country, and people that want to come to our country. And I can say that it created the environment that allowed me to be able to be a part of AI and robotics. And so this is my advisor Maya, and her advisor Rod, who's done a lot of great stuff too, and done it with inclusion. This is why we need both policy and investment, because in the end, policy defines our values and incentivizes our behavior. And so if we want to just think about, like, if we want to be very, bare metal about how we think about achieving things in research, if you want to be cynical about it, this is what you do. You create a bubble of competent looking people that exude success. You use that aura around you to get your proposals funded, and you produce results. Use that to build alliances of like-minded people that think like you. You collude with that alliance to promote your perspective and your view and your self-interest, without forgetting to dismiss dissenting of views, but with civility. I'm talking about you, reviewer, too. And then you use that patronage to get your people placed in academia and industry. And then you do that again. You use that to get more funding and more people, and you repeat this cycle over and over and over. This isn't just about research, robotics research. This is just human nature, because that is what's also driving law enforcement and police unions to avoid accountability. They have a tough job. I understand that. We need them. We need them to do their job, but we also need them to be accountable. We should be paying them more. We should be paying more taxes so that they're compensated for the risk that they take on, but they can't avoid accountability. The same way I'm not going to ask a pilot of a commercial aircraft to not be accountable for the lives that they had that they're responsible for. The same applies for law enforcement. This is something that people are really asking for. So one of my colleagues, here at Michigan, helped lead an effort to talk about how we should fund Black scientists to make it better. I would highly recommend their commentary and Cell. This is something that if you don't have diversity, you could lead to overfitting in terms of your disciplines. Many areas of science that are outside of artificial intelligence and quantum are complaining that they're getting left behind because the deck is getting stacked against them and they're not getting a chance for investment. If you're a current graduate student and you're like, I really don't like my advisor, they're not doing the right things for me. That's because they may not be incentivized to do it. And so the funding model has to incentivize the kind of behaviors that we'd like to see out of our system. And so, with this, I just want to give this example of just to hammer this home. Give this example that comes from the Stride training that we have. So if you want to sit on faculty search committee here at Michigan, you have to go through Stride training. And it talks about, one of the examples they say is that you could have two people, let's say a man and a woman, and they start in a faculty position, and they're more or less equal at the time, but there are small things about how they're treated differently in terms of the opportunities that they're given and how they can connect that lead over time as they advance in their career to small inequities that lead to different outcomes. And so this is something that continues to happen, such that over time, over the span of their careers, you can see that maybe even they look like they have the same professional standing, but they're not really equal. And and this is an effect that we're seeing that you can see over and over. If we add to this equation that when we notice how these small differences accumulate, if we add to this equation minorities in this, and we can see that there are a lot of ill effects in that there are just things that we're not given. We can be excluded by people that have power in our field that don't take on Black students, that don't produce Black graduates, that may get access to the latest equipment that allows them to better promote their work. They don't have to cite Black people. How many if you looked at if there was a diversity equivalent of an H index, what would that look like for a lot of people? Using that, they could get startup capital to make new companies with no Black people in it whatsoever. And they get more and more money to do that. Whereas if you're a minority in the field, you have a high service load. You might get honors and awards, but you're not really getting the investment to keep your research enterprise going. And I see, and that really is me. But and I see, and a lot of people that I see doing service that have these high service loads, minorities and women, I see them doing a lot of the same stuff over and over. I see the same faces over and over again. And so this really gets to a big problem. But not only that, it because it occurs over generations, that person that takes the money, the investment from one hand, with the other hand, then produces people that benefit from that system, may have the same working mode, but now they say, they might say in their diversity statement, I've talked to Black in robotics, or I've talked to AI for all, or I participate in CS Kickstart, but and they're saying this as things that they've done, but really it's about the generations before them that have created this environment. The diversity statements sometimes need to be written by the writers, the people that are writing letters of reference, so they could comment about what they've done in the ecosystem and how they're structurally addressing these problems. Because what's going to happen is, or what we start to see is that this just produces a lot of people that say, that look the same, that are saying, I did something for diversity, but really not changing the system. And so in the end, one thing that I worry about, and I told Monroe when I said yes to do this, I said I might say some things you might not like, and so with this, as we have these efforts that are still at their origin, are they just going to be about getting more investment and building community and selecting certain people to take on faculty positions or to get hired, but not really address the systemic issues needed in terms of having policies and systems that will make a difference? And so there's really we're at a crossroads here about whether this is going to be just something superficial that's going to lead to ill effects in the long term, or whether it's going to be structural and systemic progress. And so with that, I'm just going to say that, if you want to know my perspective on it, I wrote it up. Editor from VentureBeat helped me write this up, and it represents how I think we should think about AI and robotics funding, just as a thought exercise. If you want to think about how this would look from a process perspective, what if we treated non-diversity as a conflict of interest? Think about how we address conflicts of interest in our funding processes, in our publication processes, peer review, merit review. If you said that not just individuals have conflicts of interest, but cliques of researchers have conflicts of interest, and entire fields may have field-wide conflicts of interest. What does that look like? And that may get to may bring the realizations that we need more empathy in our field, because our work has real consequences. The same systems we have are just not going to scale, and so we have to do something different. So with that, I appreciate your time. I think we can do more to balance all of these things together. We can address and remedy the systemic overfitting we have in our field. We can eliminate these chokeholds on opportunity, and a lot of that comes to the economic incentive, and we can do that through modernizing existing civil rights legislation, statutes, and apply them to artificial intelligence and robotics. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chad, for this great presentation, and thank you for taking the stance on our seminar series. So yeah, it was an insightful talk and a great seed for a difficult conversation we ought to have in our community. And so now we are going to transition into our panel discussion, and I'm thrilled to have three wonderful guest panelists today. So let me first introduce Dr. Aisha Walcott-Bryant. She's a research scientist and manager at IBM Research in Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. She leads a team of researchers and engineers to use AI, blockchain, and other technologies to develop innovations in water access and management, core AI, and healthcare, particularly for emerging countries. And I'm thankful that she made the time today, because it's actually quite late for her. And I also welcome today Dr. Sarah M. Brown. She is an assistant professor at the Computer Science and Statistics Department of the University of Rhode Island. Previously, she was a postdoctoral research associate in the Data Science Initiative at Brown University and a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the Statistical AI Lab at the University of California, Berkeley. She's working on making AI more fair by enabling it to use subjective human expertise. And last but not least, we have Professor Hadas Kresqazit. She is a professor at the Sibley School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the College of Engineering of Cornell University. And Hadas works on robotics and hybrid systems, and in this context on logic, verification and synthesis, motion and task planning, and computational linguistics. And so for the audience, before we get started with the panel discussion, you can also post questions on Slido that you find below the live stream on our webpage. So just scroll down a little bit. And with that, I would open the floor and ask Hadas for a first question or comment she may have for Chad.
Thanks, Jeanette, and thank you so much for inviting me. And Chad, thank you so much for yet another amazing talk. That is, I feel you and I have the same speed. Let's put it that way. So that's it works for me. So I was going to ask you about specific policy suggestions until the last 3 minutes of your talk, where you gave a whole bunch of policy suggestions. And I think that the COI idea, the conflict of interest idea for people who have not shown any evidence of diverse thinking and openness in their research is kind of a really interesting idea. And the first thing that when as you said it, the first thing I thought about was, oh, then we're going to have a bunch of token participation in those groups. So I'm just kind of thinking about if you can comment a little bit more on this ideas of policy that people gaming the system and kind of requirement versus encouragements. And it's a little bit of a loaded question. It's not very specific, but kind of within that space.
So thank you for that question. And I think it's always, whenever we're talking about policy, it's always a difficult situation to try to figure out how people will game it. That will happen. That is something that's not just with this issue of race and diversity and equal opportunity, but you could just look at the tax code, or you could look at many different aspects of this. And I'm not a policy person. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a roboticist that sits in the lab and maybe has an opinion about amateur opinions about economics and policy. But I think the thing is that everybody is impacted by the peer review system and the merit review system. Just think about how you feel most times when you get your feedback from a grant review process, and you're just sort of like, that was dumb, and and you don't agree with it. How do you feel about that, right? Or when you get feedback from I say this as the editor of a journal, if you get feedback from let's say ICRA or IROS or RSS or the HRI conference, and how do you feel about that feedback? And the reality is that you could try to just say, well, I'm just gonna try to game the system and send out as much stuff as possible to improve my chances, but that just creates more workload for everybody else, and I think it can make us a bit miserable, and it lowers the quality of the reviews. So what I'm really saying is we need to rethink our review processes and incentivize better behavior. You're starting to see more people. I think there's talk about can an author publish the reviews that they get publicly and comment on those. Well, maybe that's something that we should be thinking about, because maybe that'll make reviewers more honest. Make program chairs hold their reviewers more accountable. Maybe that's something that will make program officers at agencies hold their reviewers and their panelists more accountable. And so I think this is really just the beginning of the discussion. Like I said, I'm an amateur policy person at best.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad and Hadass. Sarah, do you have specific questions or points of discussion?
Yeah, I'm gonna cue in on kind of a different dimension of what you brought up though, Chad. So you mentioned, you closed with that we need more empathy in computing. You earlier talked about kind of this, that we train people in a way that they're overfit, in a sense, to specific ways of doing robotics. You talked about creating this robotics pathways, creating more access for students and getting them into the program. And this kind of reminds me of a conversation that I've been seeing within the fairness, accountability, transparency community, where we talk, social scientists are a part of that community, which they think very differently. They completely, like, just the questions they ask, the way their methods are, all of this is very different. And so there's this ongoing conversation about, like, how do we account for and incorporate and consider, like, different ways of knowing and different types of knowledge production, and how that can help avoid some of these problems, because one specific discipline, it has its own kind of weaknesses. So you've been working on this robotics pathway thing to create more access for students and remove some of those barriers. How can we, I guess, what sort of incentive ideas or ways of supporting students or faculty who want to incorporate these things do you have for people to really support incorporating more empathy in there, the way they train students?
I would say that in general, the approach to curriculum is still an old, there's a lot of inertia in it. The fact that we lead with calculus, 3 to 4 semesters of calculus, that's a remnant of Sputnik era thinking. Linear algebra is what we do. And really, this is just a call to modernize. And it's modernizing with respect to the topics that we're covering and how we structure our curriculum, creating new ways for doing it, because that will lead to better outcomes. But also trying to think about how we deliver our material, with the numbers of students in class. Maybe we could be, a little bit more aloof, or maybe a little bit more focused on our research when we're dealing with, 10 to 50 students in class. But now when that 10 to 50 is now 100 to 500, as you might see in an AI or a machine learning class, my robotic class is closer to 100. That model just doesn't scale anymore. And so we have to modernize. Even if you take, if you take, racial equity out of it, this is unsustainable for a lot of students. And I think, how many irate students are you going to have talking about they can't get into class before you want to take action? And this partially is an effect of it's sort of the revenge of the liberal arts. Not everybody needs a computer science major. And I'd say that, engineering has its share of blame, in that we say social sciences are flaky and touchy-feely, and they don't really mean very much, but we're doing the real science. And social sciences can be dismissive and just sort of say, like, you're just nerdy, and and you're focused on your ways. But really, we have to come together, and we have to create new offerings that give us. I think we do have to re-embrace the liberal arts a little bit better, and so I think that's going to lead to better outcomes.
Thanks. Thanks again for this question. Aisha, do you have like a question or a discussion point?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Chad, for the presentation. I never thought I'd see a PR2 and slavery in the same set of slides and be able to flow with that story. So you speak a good language, as Hadas also mentioned. So I had two kind of questions along, two axes or two different dimensions of what you talked about. One is, have you seen any successful funding models, even if it's at a small scale, that has helped to incentivize in the way that you're envisioning in terms of inclusion and more or less diversity of thought and experience? And then the second one is a totally different dimension, is thinking about these benchmark data sets that, let's say all the AI researchers and roboticists race to. If we're looking at those data sets and we already know that, because of them, we're getting these elements of fairness in AI, is there a way to start to, address those benchmark data sets and have, different types of representations or some meta information about those data sets, so that as people are racing to them, and then if they're formulated in the right way, they're actually addressing the bigger challenges, including the elements of fairness. Two axes of thoughts.
Right. Thank you. First, I have to say, Aisha, it is wonderful to hear such good words about my talk from you, and I have so much respect for your work. Even going back to when you were doing SLAM back at MIT, there were so few Black women in that space that I've always respected everything that you've accomplished. And so I would say I'll take the second question first, because I forgot the first one. But the thing is that I am not a social scientist. I don't know how to make fair data sets. I don't understand how to run a user study, even though I'm the editor of the Journal of Human, I'm the editor in chief of the transactions on human robot interaction. I could not tell you the difference between a good empirical study and a bad empirical study. That's why I have other people on my team, but I do know a lot about computation. And what makes us stronger is that we have interdisciplinary, that respect on both sides. So if I want to know how to make my data sets fair, I should go talk to somebody from the social sciences. If I want to, and they're the ones that could really help me figure out how to deal with this problem, because they're the experts in that area. Now, if they want to have a computational problem about how they should structure, an algorithm to do, to this type of classification, or to run a particular type of statistics that's beyond just a t-test, I can help them with that. And so we really do have to work together as an academy. Can you remind me your first question? I forgot what it was.
Yeah, the first one was briefly, if you have seen any even small scale models that of the funding and the incentive model for diversity of thought, more inclusion, that have worked well, or that seem to be going the direction in which you envision.
Right. The simple answer to that is no, not even close. But there have been people, because there's a lot of inertia in the system, because at the end of the day, people say, well, why should we consider, elevate broader impact to the same level, the broader impact of a work to the same level of the intellectual merit? Because we've always just sort of thought, underneath underlying our the dynamics of our field is that we just think about the intellectual merit of what we do. And there have been good people, I do think the leadership of a lot of agencies are trying to bring their organizations along to say we have to do more than just look at the technical aspects of the work and then have a checkbox of a laundry list of things that somehow address diversity and equal opportunity in a superficial way. And so, so there are things like to better improve broadening participation in computing, which are respectable efforts. But in the end, the question is are they going to have the long-term effect? Or is the system going to say that's enough and that's it, we've done diversity and so we can move on? And I worry that in the end that will look like an Atlanta compromise. The effect of that 20 years, 30 years, 50 years down the road will not have the intended effect. But there are a diversity of opinions in our field, and so I'm just really one voice, and nobody really knows. But we have to have that discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we have some audience question from the Slido interface. So Yves, you had like one question that you wanted to pose.
Yeah, Chad. So first I want to say great talk. Really, really enjoyed listening to you speak. And so we have a question from Rian asking, on the academics front, how can students push back on college policy to get faculty both the teaching and empathy training they need to create academic and research structure and opportunities that actually support folks with different life experiences? For example, those who are ADA, Black, LGBTQ, older, things of that nature.
Thank you, Yves. Great to see you. I hear your research is going really well, which is always great to see as somebody who will be the future of our field. I would love to say, training is one part of it. Training can help. And I think students have oftentimes have a more significant voice than they give themselves credit for. And so just being able to voice that to your faculty advisor, to your department chair, to the leadership of your university, I think goes a long way. But doing it with respect and doing it knowing that you want to have a partnership and making sure that you're committed to have, you have to have some skin in the game. You have to put in order to get back. But really at the end of the day, I think this is a policy issue. People are driven by incentives. As faculty, we are asked to do too much. We've got to go do research and advise students. We've got to teach. We've got to go raise funding. We got to do service, not just to our department, but the university, to our communities, to our larger profession. And we just don't have enough time in the day. So you can ask for it, but we may not be able to deliver it unless there's an incentive for us to do so. And that is where the policy comes in. If my funding model changes, you don't have to, you may not even need specific training. The incentives will make people go out and request that for they will go out and develop it and make sure it happens, because then the bottom line, their bottom line is aligned with being able to create equal opportunity. And so this really then, we've seen this with respect to sexual harassment. The director of the National Institutes of Health has come out and said that they're going to take more seriously issues of sexual harassment by people that by investigators that they are funding. That I think gets the attention of people so that they will change their behavior.
I'm going to jump in here on that note, in that I've actually felt relatively supported in growing in my teaching, and in particularly those dimensions, being more inclusive in my teaching, having more equitable grading standards, being more, all of these things. And I think one of the things that we have here at URI is that our Center for Teaching and Learning not only provides training for faculty on these points, but they pay us to attend those trainings. So I can get, they're small amounts of dollars, but like, I can go get some extra money in order to learn how to do these things. And so I think that's, at least it's a small example, but it is an example of something where the institution has decided that they're going to back helping, they want to push faculty to teach better, to teach more equitably, to teach more inclusively, to grade better. I just came from a panel on more equitable grading styles. And they pay us to learn these things. Like, faculty aren't trained to teach or all of the other things, but they pay us to put effort into that as a part of our job as faculty members. And so I think that's one small thing universities can do. And it's a little bit easier to change a single university than the entire federal funding system, but that's one example.
Thank you. So Apurva, you had like another question from the audience.
Yeah, that's right. So first of all, thanks for that amazing talk. And the question I'd like to ask is one that was posed in the chat from an anonymous poster. They say that you talked about how it's difficult to get enough funding and support your own research engine when you also have a high service load similar to the experience of women and other minorities. So they ask, what are your tips for graduate students who are struggling with the same sort of idea where they want to volunteer time to change the system, but also balance that against their research progress?
Great. I think I really appreciate that question because really, what you have to ask yourself, this is something I've struggled with in my career, is that there's sort of ends of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, I could focus on my professional development and not necessarily reach out to do the things that will create opportunities for others, but really through my success, I will be an example for others, right? On the other side, I could actively take steps to reach out and to create opportunities, knowing that I'm going to take a professional, I'll be at a professional disadvantage for that. And that is the high service load. And typically people aren't at one extreme, and they may fluctuate during their career. Like there was on the tenure track, you have to be focused on your career. As a graduate student, you have to be focused on your career. You can do some things, but you can't get sucked into having a high service load. And so, post tenure, I'm like, all right, what, I can take a larger view and see what this looks like. But really the funding model sort of pushes us to one of those extremes, and it's hard to have a happy medium. And so we need, if I had to say the thing that we really need, we need more funding, right? We need that greater investment. We need the taxpayer has to be willing to invest in science and technology in order for us to get closer to that happy medium. So we have the bandwidth to do it. Right now, if you look at funding rates, I believe they used to be in the 30%. You submit a proposal, you got a 35% chance of it being successful. And, that's really at the level of where science should be. Now, I believe we're in the single digits. And when you have a hyper competitive environment, it leads towards overfitting. It leads to more opportunistic behavior. And that is, if we're going to really want a research enterprise, we have to pay for it.
So Chad, you were talking a little bit about, well, not a little bit, you were talking about policy, you were talking about education. And there's another element to this question of fairness and equal opportunities and all that, and that is industry. And as we all know, there has been incidents recently, specifically Dr. Gabru and Dr. Mitchell's firing from Google. And they were doing work exactly at the space that you were talking about. You actually cited one of them, right? And then there's this tension, obviously, in industry between the greater good and the bottom line. And I'm wondering how your thoughts on that situation, on policy, and how to enact policy on really, really powerful, not resourceful, but entities that have a lot of resources, but not a lot of influence from the federal government, where policy can be more effective.
Right. So thank you for that, Hadass. And I really appreciate that question because at the end of the day, companies do have a tension that they have to deal with, and that if they don't make money, they won't exist, right? A diverse company that's not sufficiently productive will not be a company for very long. But the issue is that the rise of these companies, they've moved fast and they've broken things, and that's when they were in startup mode. But it's time to grow up if you're really going to take this much share of the economy. It's time to no longer just be to just sort of be hacking things. You have to be stewards of the field, stewards of the ecosystem. That means that that you can't just go around. I think the term is eating the seed corn. I believe that they are eating the seed corn because if you're trying, we see this in faculty hiring right now, trying to hire people that can teach robotics, AI, machine learning courses is really hard because there's so much demand, and a lot of people go to industry. I worry that that a lot of people want both the intellectual freedom of academia with the perks and the benefits of big technology, and those two things toward the limit are incompatible. But they could be if we had good partnership on the industry side. A lot of the weeding out that happens in our computer science departments is because companies are looking for students with a CS major, and they're willing to pay that much more for it, and that message has come in loud and clear to students. And so all of them are really competing, hyper competing for those jobs. But everybody doesn't need a computer science major. If companies were willing to say, all right, we need computer science majors to do, maybe to work on the core search team and do those things. But we also could use to people to do project management or design or UX that don't need a CS degree, and emphasize that more. So that people don't feel like they have to get a CS degree, so they're competitive for different types of jobs that are going to be available in industry. Because right now the signal that is sent by tech companies to students is creating an unsustainable curricular model, an unsustainable education model for computer science departments, and that is weeding out a lot of diversity right now. I believe your big 5 tech companies, if they chose a different way of recruiting, it would improve our diversity numbers very quickly.
I maybe wanted to follow up on this one. So you just said, like, if big companies would do this, then things would change. And I think before we also had this point on if there was an accountability of editors or reviewers, then maybe things would change. And I'm wondering, how could this concretely look like, right? Like, for example, an accountability for editors and reviewers, how would the impact, for example, be measured? What are the metrics here that could even be applied in a policy, right? Like, it's hard to even discuss this. So I don't know, maybe on the academic side, who could steer that effort to maybe create that? And then on the industry side, I also wouldn't know, like, what's the incentive again for industry to change, really? I honestly don't know. I don't see it, because the incentive is money, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the role of government. Companies, their job is to look after companies and to make money. The job of government is to look after people, which is why there is a move to regulate big technology companies. But we may not need that regulation if big tech companies behaved better. I don't know the overall landscape of that, but I do know when it comes to higher education, to how we're educating future engineers and computer scientists, just a more enlightened recruiting policy. We need, if a recruiter just looks at a resume and says CS major and with a high GPA, and therefore you're in and you make the next cut, and everybody else gets weeded out, that is what's cascading back. Maybe a more holistic and a more inclusive policy, because it's not just Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell. It's, you can see reports about how students from HBCUs are treated. And that is, and that's something that has been continual, and it's not something you can just throw money at in the interim, go on TV and say, look, we're doing something. It really has to be something that's measured over time, longitudinally. When it comes to the metrics that you've mentioned and how we could look at this as editors and reviewers, we're making it up as we go along. There are people that study how that, and it actually gets to a deeper issue of how do you define equal opportunity. And that really is one of the major questions that we have to look at. I hope that the algorithmic fairness community can take a good look at it, but I worry that some of the assumptions they work with are just not grounded enough. You need better in algorithmic fairness. You need better representation, because because if you define fairness and that definition is flawed, then people will think if they accord to that definition, they think what they're doing is fair, but it's not fair. It will lead to bad effects. And so this is where the rest of the academy could come together. And so despite that high level, broader answer, I think, I think if I'm looking at this as an editor, my co-editor in chief and I, we look at the numbers all the time, and we're looking to see who are we recruiting, what reviewers are coming on. We're trying to balance this as best as possible. I think a lot of people are trying to do their best. We just don't have the tools to do it. But this is an intellectual challenge that we have to address. But I think if you just take the time to dig up some numbers and look at it, even at a high level, you can see what we're producing as a system. You gotta take time to do it though.
Yeah, it takes time. Okay, yeah, so we have like another question from the audience. Krishnan.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing talk. And I think this question maybe even relates to the discussion a little bit, but shifting the focus towards sort of conference venues in particular. But the question is, instead of needing to form sort of individual diversity panels for each and every conference venue, are there higher level channels that can be used to integrate these values for more diverse participation in academia or conferences at large? So like, what is the layer above that can work with individual conferences rather than within each conference having to like build these things from the ground up?
Right. Another awesome question. This is great. So I would say that we should also understand that our peer review system, our merit review system, when we're reviewing papers, what we do is we recruit some people, usually people we know, and they give us 2 to 4 subjective opinions about a piece of work, and without reproducing it. And so I worry that what we have is something that really isn't a scientific review process. It's really just something that is that's just conjecture, right? Informed conjecture, usually very useful conjecture when reviews are done right, but it's not. But if you want to be scientific about it, what we should do is when you get a paper, you should reproduce that paper and see what and see what came out of that. But that assumes that that people are willing to do that. I think the thing that we could do is build better ways for people to understand other ideas that are in the space, and potentially do that through emphasizing reproducibility in what we do. Some things are easy. We've been able to see with neural networks and things that are MATLAB or PyTorch friendly, or Python friendly. But like, how do we do that for robotics when we need systems, we need things that actually take action in the world? But when you see it and you're working together with people, I think that builds a lot of bridges. It's really hard to do. I don't have, I'd have to, to have specific suggestions. It really requires not just for me to think about how we could do it, but how do I convince other people to make this happen? But if you just sat and hacked with people, or you saw somebody's work and you really took an investment in it, I think that really is what's going to make the difference. Because I know how I feel when I read a good paper and I get a chance to implement it myself, usually in JavaScript these days. That's like, that's a really good feeling. And I love having discussions with the authors about that work. That was what's going to help us build a lot of bridges.
Thanks. So we have like one last question from the audience, Yves.
So from the chat, and actually from the last things you said, right, you're talking about building bridges, and it sounds like a very inclusive way, I think, to go about this research enterprise. However, in academia, it seems that all roads seem to lead to a very small subset of schools and institutions. And so the question is, academia as a whole has been largely unfair. Only a handful of people / institutions have dictated the direction of most scientific fields. The development in AI / deep learning is, in my opinion, just another instance of this phenomenon. What, in your opinion, would be a way to break this loop?
Right. I think that is an issue. Not only issue, they get to the core of the issue, in that really there may be really good ideas out there, but if you're not part of the network, if you're not part of the top 5, you're not part of the clique, you can't even get consideration for your idea. And it's really hard to do that because now we have so many ideas, so many papers out there that that it's hard to get your head around anything. But the thing is, and I worry what we do is we reward not necessarily projects and ideas, we reward people, and the good ideas and the good projects are sort of a byproduct of that sort of that sort of cliquish sort of system. And so so how do we change that? I do believe that that emphasizing reproducibility of the work is something that we could do. I believe that we should produce less papers. We should have fewer papers. Right now, the thing that is driving our system is to get our Google Scholar, our Google Scholar page, filled with entries and jack up the citation count. But really, at the end of the day, how many of those ideas are groundbreaking or really, really going to help us, advance our field beyond just sort of an increment, beyond an epsilon. And so in order to do that, we have to really, maybe we should be producing fewer ideas, emphasizing them and beyond the least publishable unit into larger journal papers. I believe the journal model could work. And with things like archive, where you can put an idea out when it's ready, as opposed to trying to meet a deadline every 6 months. I think that has more potential. But I think it's I think at the end of the day, if we have to consider more ideas that are out there. Well, let me say it this way. I worry that if you're going to have, when I was a graduate student, machine learning was all about generalization from sparse examples. It was all about Bayesian inference, understanding what the model could do. And there were other ideas out there to use neural networks, but it took somebody of Jeff Hinton's stature to be able to bring that to the front. And other people, I'm not saying it's Jeff Hinton, but you had to be in order to affect change. And I think that model should give people concern. How do we effectively promote ideas and get them out there? I believe an emphasis on reproducibility is really, ideas around reproducibility are what's going to help us get out of local minimum.
All right, as we wrap up, I would just like to thank you again, Chad, for a great talk. Thank you to our guest panelists, Hadass, Aisha, Sarah. Thank you to our student panelists, Yves, Apurva, Krishnan. This is wonderful. And thank you all. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.